In this video, we are going to create a value scale and a couple of gradations using graphite pencil. So I've got my drawing paper, my sharpener, I've got a ruler, or you could simply use anything with a straight edge, and I have an array of different graphite pencils, a graphite stick, and I've got some paper towel to fold into blenders. We are going to start with our HB pencil, also known as a number 2 pencil. So this will be our lightest pencil. So first I'm just going to construct an area to create our value scale. So I'm just going to need a long rectangle. So I'll just use the top and bottom of the ruler to create this, and it's going to have 5 spaces, so I'm going to give an inch for each space. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it'll be about that long. Make it just a little bit short of that inch mark since we've got some extra room out here. All right, so it is not essential that this is perfect, but if you want to be precise about it, you can be. So you just need to create this space for yourself. If you are using a ruler, then you can just create your inches, but if you're not using a ruler, if you're using a straight edge, the easiest way to break this down would be to find approximately your middle point and then create a space around that middle point, and then just divide each of the other 2 sides into 2 spaces. So it's not essential that these be 100% even. Alright, so once you do create that structure, then you're going to want it to be precise so that you can create your value scale within that. So I'll do that off camera to save time. Okay, so I have just cleaned this up and I have also labeled it value scale. You should do the same before moving on. So now we want to designate a high end and a low end. So we'll make our low end black. So this is going to be our darkest, or black. All right, and we'll label this 1. So then we can just go ahead and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it doesn't matter which direction you have this go. I could have started from here and made this black. That's fine. I am going to also label this low key, so you will hear people refer to an image that uses the dark end of the value scale as low key, and I'll label this as high key. So an image that uses all light tones would be high key, and then of course this will be our medium. So first thing we want to remember is that we need to leave white. So I'm going to also label this white. So we're not going to touch this at all. So I'm going to actually start with number 4 here, and I'm going to start to shade this very carefully. So whenever we're shading, we're starting from the edges and shading in, and I've got very, very light marks, very, very small marks. So on camera, you may not even be able to see what I'm doing at all because they are so light. So you can keep those smooth, or I'm actually creating little tiny hatch marks, but they're so small that they're basically smooth. I'm then going to switch directions when I get to the other side. so that way I'm creating a buffer zone no matter which way I'm going. So I'm starting at the line and coming in. So our lines are dark enough that you can see them on camera, so they might stand out from my shading a little bit, but when we are shading a realistic image, we would have the edge or the line match the shading. So you would not see your outline separate, and that's going to be very important. So that's one of the reasons we always start at the edge, is because you do not want to see a distinct line. You would only want to see an edge. So that's happening a bit down here. So as you go, I'm just going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to take this same approach at all of the edges. So starting from the edge and shading in. So that shading may overlap a little bit. Right. And you can turn your paper in order to make this a little bit easier as you go. So when I'm drawing, I'm constantly turning my paper. So as you can see, this is a fairly slow process. And I do want you to practice it like this, because you may be thinking, oh, well, when I draw, I make big marks and then I just use my finger or a blending tool to rub them and smooth them out. But first of all, there's only so much smoothing that you can do that way, even when using graphite. And second of all, as you start to move toward other materials, not all materials are affected by rubbing them, so you can't always get a blend that way. So we want to be able to create a smooth mark just with our pencil or whatever tool it is we're using. So now I've created my buffer zone on all sides, and I can very, very lightly fill these in. So my marks might be separate kind of hatch marks, or your pencil might never leave the page. Either way is fine. I find when I'm shading very lightly, lifting my pencil just a little bit and having these very, very small, not maybe 1/8 of an inch if even, lines or hatch marks just right together can give me a smoother and lighter value overall. So very, very small marks. And I am having to go fairly slowly to keep these as light as I want. All right, so I'm going to continue this off camera. So as you can see, with a little bit of practice, now I'm going a little bit faster. I can keep my pencil on the page more, and all of my marks are just going one direction. Because I've created those buffer zones, that's not a problem. And the direction that I chose is almost always going to match up with at least one side of whatever shape or form you're drawing. So in this case, it just felt the most natural to use a vertical mark. And now that I'm finished, I don't even really need to blend with a blending tool or my finger, but if I do want to or need to a little bit, I'm just folding up my piece of paper towel. It's a small one because I want to get a small point. So once I've folded that up, I'm just going to make a point at either the corner or center, it doesn't matter. And when I'm blending, notice I'm staying inside whatever edge. So I didn't go over this edge. I would not go over this edge like this. I'm starting at the edge and just going in. So I don't necessarily need to blend everywhere. I'm just going to blend where I feel like I need to. The reason I would not ever go over any edge is because I usually want to keep a nice crisp, clean edge. So I want this rectangle to stay looking like a crisp rectangle. And this is usually true in your drawing as well. So if you have a form, you want the edge to stay separate and clear from the space around it. There are exceptions. We've talked in class about things that might have soft edges. So usually the most common example of that is a shadow. But unless you specifically want to create a soft edge, you would be just shading within whatever shape or form you're using. If you do get too dark, you can erase just a little bit. So I could use my eraser like a drawing tool and essentially hatch or stipple to kind of erase and still have a bit of a gradation. And then I would go back and I might blend that. I did not use the same end. I used a different end that's clean, because if you're using a dirty blending tool, you're actually going to end up adding darkness, adding value, making it darker. So if you're trying to make it lighter, always blend with a clean tool. So that's one of the advantages of making your own tool. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the darkest end of my value scale. I could do this whole value scale just with my HB and just press a lot harder. So I can get quite a bit darker just by doing that. So I'm overlapping and pressing harder. But I do have other pencils here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use them. I have an ebony, but the ebony actually has a slightly different color black, if you will, because it's made a little bit differently. So I'm going to go with my 6B, and in fact, you know what, even though that's my darkest, I might even go with my 2B or my 4B. You can get really dark with these. This is my 2B, but they don't smudge as easily. So a lot of times my 2B will be my go-to pencil. And then 4B is even darker. It does smudge a little bit more easily, but not as easily as, say, my 6B. So I think right now I'm going to choose my 4B. So I'm using my 4B and I'm using the same technique where I'm going to do all my edges first. So I could turn this. In fact, I usually do turn this because this vertical line is just so much easier. And notice I'm starting at my edge. So I may start by kind of creating a darker outline, but it doesn't show in the end because I'm always then shading inward. So you never want to have that really dark outline that's standing out when you're shading and trying to create a realistic look. The reason for that is that in the real world or in a photograph, you do not see outlines. The only lines you might see might be something that's long and thin. Say a tree branch might appear like a line to your eye, but you really do not see outlines. All right, I'm going to take this off camera. I'm going to use that same technique I did over here, doing all my edges first and then shading in. So I'm just finishing up my edges, Make sure to keep your marks really small. It can be tempting to kind of move down a long area of an edge at once and try to have long marks, but those longer marks will show. So I'm just keeping my marks still about 1/8 of an inch. If you have a longer mark, not only will it show, but it tends to get kind of curved because your arm or your wrist will naturally kind of make a curve. And again, we're having our marks follow the edges of the shape or of the form. So if you have a rectangle, I'm either using a vertical mark like I am now, or maybe you're using a horizontal mark. So pressing hard and or also going over an area more than once. Both of those will make the value darker. Okay, I've now finished the dark end of my value scale. So if I want to, I can blend a little bit, though I barely need to. Again, my blending occurs only inside the edges. And after I use my blending tool that I've created on this, my blending tool is going to be very dark. So that can actually be helpful if I'm doing a drawing where I want to have something with a soft edge, I want to give a shadow somewhere, I can actually create that soft edge with my blending tool. I can shade some of this in with my blending tool. And it does give you this really soft, blended, smooth look, even more so than I can get with my pencil. Okay, that said, now we are going to continue with our different areas of the drawing. Before I do that, now that I've got some pencil on here, some graphite, I'm going to need a larger piece of paper towel. So I'm going to take another piece of paper towel separate from your blender. This is going to be my protector. So I'm going to put this over top here. So as I'm continuing to draw and shade, instead of putting my hand on this, and then if I do that, my hand is going to get dirty. I'm going to be accidentally rubbing this, smearing this. The whole paper pretty soon is going to have pencil on it, whether I want it to or not. Instead of that happening, if I put this down, it's going to protect my paper from all of that accidental shading that would happen or smearing that would happen. So when you've taken a really long time to get the exact value you want and the gradations that you want, the last thing you want to have to do is go back and fix it all because you've smeared it with your hand. So this will prevent that. All right, I'm now going to switch to either my HB pencil or my 2B pencil to do this medium value. So again, starting at the edge, now I don't have to be as careful about being super, super light. So to get really, really light before, I was lifting my pencil and doing hatch marks at first. With this, I can just create this blend where I keep my pencil on the page the whole time. I can let my marks overlap with one another and get a little bit darker. I could, if I want to, use an a 2B. So you can use whichever feels more comfortable and more natural to you. In fact, I may even want to try this out maybe on this edge, because this will show me right away, okay, do I have enough contrast? So if I'm doing this and I don't have enough contrast, then I might switch over to my 2B to get more contrast. So some of you will naturally press rather hard when you draw. Some of you will naturally press very lightly. So there's not one right answer to this. So as I keep going, I'm just turning my page, being very, very careful in these corner areas. But then once I do that corner, then I can just move more naturally across this edge. I think for myself, the HB is the better fit for this. But again, that's going to depend. Some of you will find that you always need to work to make your work a little darker. Some of you will always work hard to make your work a little bit lighter. All right, so I'm going to go all along my edges, and then I will continue in the center. So I'm going to pause and go off screen for a bit. So I'm just continuing with my very small marks once I've created that buffer zone, pressing a medium weight, making some of these lines go over one another to create that medium value as evenly as I can. This actually feels kind of odd to me to try to make this whole area the same exact tone. Normally when I'm drawing, I'm using gradations all the time, and we will be practicing that next. But for now, we're practicing not only creating this smooth mark, but also how to create a contrast between different middle values or gray tones, which as you're doing a realistic drawing, you'll have a lot of those gray tones. So how do you create contrast between them? The world is not black and white, either metaphorically or literally. So how do you create contrast so we can see those differences between the grays? Okay, I went off camera for a bit, and now I'm just finishing this area up. And I can finish by using a blending tool. I might be careful. I might want to stay away from the area that's really dark so that I don't make it too dark. And when I'm blending this, I'm staying inside the edges. If I really, really need to and want to get this perfectly smooth, I may need to go back and touch up certain areas and make them a little bit darker. I might need to use my eraser. So I am just basically stippling or hatching in this area so that I'm erasing, but I'm not completely erasing. So now I've got a pretty smooth, consistent middle gray value. So now I can go ahead and I'm going to move on to the number 2 square. So this is going to be my medium dark or second darkest. So I'm going to switch to my 2B. So again, this is not going to be the same for everybody. So maybe it's the 2B for you, maybe it's still the HB for you. All right, and so I'm making sure that I have a contrast between my darkest square and my second darkest. Don't worry too much if you're not sure that there's a contrast between these yet. You can go back and fix that at the end if you need to. And this is one of the tricks that you will find when you are drawing, is that sometimes, you know, it's not about making the whole thing consistently have a contrast, as I was saying. Often you just need to create the contrast along the edge, and then you can use a gradation and change the value across the object or the form. Right, so I'm using this same technique that I've done before. So notice you do not see the edges that I started with, those outlines. You see an edge, but you don't see an outline, I should say. The edge and the outline become one and the same. Okay, so now I've gotten over to the other side. So I'm switching directions, and again, I want to make sure to create this contrast. So I'm going to go a little bit darker maybe to make sure I have this contrast along the edge. If I need to, maybe I do need to make this a little bit lighter along this other edge. So I'm just using my eraser on the 3 side of the line. So again, almost stippling or hatching with that on the 3 side. And then pressing a little bit harder, going a little bit darker on the 2 side. So keeping my marks really small as I work my way slowly up this edge. If you try to do just sort of an outline the whole way up, you do sometimes end up with that outline popping out, and we want the opposite. No outline, just an edge between 2 shades. Alright, so I'm touching up that corner, making sure that this is a little bit darker than my number 3, a little bit lighter than my number 2. So I am going over some of the areas that maybe were too light at first. And then after I go over those areas, then I'll continue to shade in the middle and continue to use my protective paper towel here. Really small marks. Alright, so you guys I think get the picture, so I'll continue off screen for a little bit. Okay, so I've finished up my shading off camera. Now I'm going to continue to touch this up so I have a more consistent gray. So I'm filling in any places where it looks too light to me by going over that with another layer. So remember, you get different values both by applying pressure or less pressure, and you also get different values by going over areas with multiple layers. So that's what I'm doing now, trying to even this out. If I needed to, I could also go in with my eraser. Whenever I get to an edge, I need to make sure I stay within those lines. So if I need to shade at an edge, I'm generally going to turn my paper. And I can touch this up as I need to, keeping these edges nice and crisp and with plenty of contrast. So you can see I've got plenty of contrast along my edges, so I could continue to touch that up a little bit, but basically I think I pretty much have that now. If you need to, again, you can use your blending tool, but you're going to make sure that whenever you blend, you're staying on the inside of the lines. So from the edge in, with your blending tool, if you are going to use that. And then again, this blending tool will be really dark, so you would not want to use this in an area that you want to stay light. All right, so make sure at this point, once you've finished, it's labeled value scale. You've got the numbers with 5 being the white because that's the high key, so 5 and 4, high numbers, high key. You've got your medium is your 3, and then you've got your low key, your darkest, and your medium dark over here. I will say that the numbering is not always consistent. You'll sometimes see the numbering flipped. There really is not a standard, but since low key and high key are terms that you will see artists use sometimes, I just decided to have my numbering consistent with those terms. So low being the low numbers. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and do a practice gradation. So again, I'm going to create an area to do this in. So I'll start that by using my straight edge or my ruler, whatever you have, and just creating an area. And actually, I'm going to create a smallish area. So even though I've started this fairly large, I'm actually going to make this more like an inch long. All right, so I'm going to shorten that down. Okay, so I took a moment to clean this up, and we're going to create a fairly short gradation. You might have a gradation of any length. You could have a gradation that's going to be a smooth gradation as long as your whole value scale here, or even longer, but it's probably harder to create a shorter gradation, so that's what we're going to practice here. While I was off camera, I also sharpened my pencil. I'm going to do this pretty much only with my number 2 pencil, my 2B pencil, so my medium tone. I might vary that and maybe use a couple others too, but that's mainly what I'm going to use. So which pencil you choose is up to you. So here I'm going to start along the edge that I want to have be the darkest. And I'm starting with that edge. I don't want to see a separate outline. Never want to see a separate outline from your shading. I really can't think of any time when I would want that. Who knows, there may be an exception. Next time I encounter an exception, then I'll stand corrected, but I cannot think of one right now. All right, so I'm moving along this. Right now, this is just looking like a thick outline, so you want to make sure it doesn't stay that way. So I'm flipping so that I can get these edges done really precisely. All right, so when you're creating a gradation, it may be a little bit harder to make sure your edges are smooth, but I'm still using that same buffer zone. And then I basically am going to start my gradation as I do this edge. So as I move along the edge, shading inward, I'm also getting a little bit lighter with each little baby step. Until I'm just tickling the surface. At that point, you may decide you want to switch to your HB, but ultimately I want to fade out to white. All right, so here I'm just barely tickling the surface, maybe using tiny little hatch marks. So I've got my gradation started. same process is going to happen down here. Notice I'm flipping my page for ease. I'm also moving around my paper towel as I need it. So that's protecting everything from smudging. So the last thing you want to do after you've created your beautiful gradation with your beautiful, careful, smooth marks, last thing you want to do is smear it all so it ends up being just one middle gray. So having that paper towel underneath your hand will protect from that. And right now it's not doing anything, but I'm just keeping it underneath my hand so I don't forget about it. All right, so now I've got my top and bottom buffer zone. I need to match that gradation in the middle. So notice I'm especially going to pay careful attention to this edge of that thick outline that I started with. I don't want that to stay a thick outline, so I have to make sure that as I transition, I'm getting rid of that hard edge by sort of starting right at it or just over it and then getting lighter slowly. So eventually all of this will become like second nature to you, but as you're learning it, you're really going to have to think about, okay, did I create a smooth gradation? Is it consistent? I think this very edge here, where you want it to fade to white, that might be the hardest part. So I did switch pencils there as I'm moving to kind of my lighter end of the value scale. And one trick that I'm going to use, as I fade to white, I'm not going to have it be a consistent kind of vertical line, if you will. I want that area where it fades to white to be uneven. That'll help create that illusion that it's just disappearing. If you're trying to like make it disappear, but it's all lining up perfectly, it's going to be really hard to create that. So without even touching a paper towel or a blending tool or rubbing this at all, I've already got this really strong gradation. So strong meaning really subtle, really. It's pretty smooth. All right, and then if I want it even smoother, and this is an if, there is such a thing as over blending. But if I want this even smoother, and you will not always want that, but if I do, then I can very carefully, and notice I'm staying on the left side. I will never cross over that edge. Over here I want a soft edge. But I want that hard edge to remain a hard edge. And there you go, I've got my green.